The air was thick with emotion as the young woman stood alone, her face streaked with tears, gazing at the weathered stone that marked her mother's final resting place. The silence was almost too much to bear, broken only by the quiet rustling of leaves. It was a moment of deep sorrow, but also one of reflection. She had been coming here for years, paying her respects, and keeping the memory of her mother alive. But today, the grief felt different. Today, her thoughts wandered to a memory she had never shared with anyone, not even her mother. As she stood there, she whispered softly, her voice trembling with emotion. A stranger gave a hungry child a meal. Years later, that child was his boss. These words, simple yet profound, carried a weight far beyond the grave. They were the key to a story that would forever change her life and the lives of everyone involved. You see, the girl standing before her mother's grave wasn't just anyone. She was the daughter of a woman who had known hardship, a woman who had survived against all odds. But that survival wasn't just due to her own strength. It was because of a chance encounter, a moment of kindness from a stranger that set in motion a series of events none of them could have predicted. The child she once was had been hungry, alone, and lost in a world that didn't seem to care. But then a stranger came along, offering food when it seemed like there was no hope. That simple gesture changed everything. Years later, the tables would turn in the most unexpected way. The child, now grown and successful, would cross paths again with the stranger who had shown her compassion all those years ago. But this time, things were different. This time, the roles were reversed. The girl had become a woman with power, influence, and a seat at the table, while the man who had once helped her now found himself in a position of need. The story, however, was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. But how did it all come to this? How did a moment of kindness from a stranger lead to such a twist of fate? And what were the deeper lessons hidden within this incredible story? The answers are waiting, but they're not as simple as they might seem. As the woman stood there at her mother's grave, the memories of her childhood flashed before her eyes. She thought about the struggles her mother had faced, the sacrifices she had made, and the lessons she had taught her. She remembered how her mother used to tell her, "Never forget where you came from, and never forget the people who helped you along the way." It was a lesson she had taken to heart, but one that would soon be put to the test in ways she never could have imagined. In the coming days, she would find herself faced with a decision, one that would not only shape her future, but the future of the man who had once helped her. Would she remember the kindness he had shown her all those years ago? Or would the passage of time and the changes in their circumstances cloud her judgment? The decision she was about to make would define who she was, not just as a person, but as a leader. The weight of it all settled in her chest as she turned away from her mother's grave. Her heart was heavy with the memories of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The world had changed so much, and yet some things remained the same. People were still kind, but they were also selfish. They still made mistakes, but sometimes those mistakes had the power to shape destinies in ways that were beyond their control. And as she walked away from the grave, her footsteps echoed in the quiet cemetery, a haunting reminder that life was never as simple as it seemed. The stranger's kindness had set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could have foreseen. But now, as the woman prepared to step into the future, she couldn't help but wonder if she was about to be given the opportunity to repay that kindness in a way she never imagined. The real question, however, was whether she would recognize the opportunity when it came knocking. Because in this world, sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones we least expect. And as she moved forward, the woman knew that the next chapter of her story was about to unfold in ways she couldn't yet understand. And with that, we leave you with a question. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Would you extend a hand to a stranger, just as one had once extended a hand to you? Or would you forget the past and leave behind the kindness that had once saved you? The answer lies in the next part of this story, and it's a twist that might just leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fate, kindness, and the power of human connection. Stay tuned, because this journey is far from over. The days that followed were a blur for the young woman. It wasn't just the memory of her mother's grave that haunted her. It was the weight of the decision that lingered. The story of the stranger who had once fed her when she was nothing but a hungry child had been a part of her family's legacy, a tale her mother had told her countless times. But now, as she stood at the helm of a successful company, the situation had grown complicated. The stranger she had once seen as a figure of charity had come back into her life, not as a savior, but as a man with a troubled past, a man whose mistakes had left him vulnerable and in need of the very same help he had once offered her. The man, Henry, had changed since the last time she'd seen him. Years ago, he had been a struggling businessman, working long hours just to get by. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and somewhere along the line, Henry's ambition had led him down a dark path. He made decisions that compromised his integrity, ignored the warnings of those who cared about him, and ultimately found himself entangled in a series of financial and personal struggles that had left him at rock bottom. But despite his fall from grace, Henry still had that same warmth, that same generosity he had shown her mother all those years ago. The woman recalled the kindness in his eyes, the way he had shared his last meal with her. A young girl who had no idea what tomorrow would bring. Her mother often said that it was because of Henry's kindness that they had survived that terrible winter when they were barely scraping by. The twist was in the timing. When Henry entered her life again, it wasn't as the stranger from her childhood, but as a man looking for a second chance. Her company, the one she had built from the ground up, was struggling. The competition had become fierce, and investors were pulling back. It was in this environment of uncertainty that Henry, now a man with valuable experience, but a tarnished reputation, appeared with an offer to help. At first, she had hesitated. How could she trust him again? After all, the same man who had helped her as a child had made choices that now seemed unforgivable. His reputation had been ruined, and the scars of his past mistakes were visible. He wasn't the same man who had once shared a meal with her. He was a man who had lost everything. But there was something about him that made her second-guess everything. Despite his fall from grace, he had always been a man of principles. His downfall wasn't the result of greed or malice, but of mistakes made in the pursuit of something greater. And as she stood on the edge of losing her own empire, she found herself facing a dilemma. Could she take the risk of trusting him again? Could she bring someone into her life who, despite his history, might be the key to turning everything around? The stakes were high. She knew that. And yet, the very essence of her struggle, the conflict that gnawed at her heart, wasn't just about business. It was about the deep moral quandary of giving someone a second chance when the world had written them off. Could she afford to do what was right, even if it meant risking everything she had worked for? As the days went by, the tension in the air grew thicker. Henry continued to prove his worth, offering advice, strategies, and solutions that made her business more efficient. But every success came with a lingering question. Could she really trust him? Could she truly forgive the man who had been a stranger once, but had now become a symbol of the very things she feared? And then, one evening, the tipping point came. Henry showed up at her office, looking worn, as if the weight of the world had once again fallen on his shoulders. He had always been composed in front of her, but now he seemed vulnerable, a man on the edge of breaking. "I need to be honest with you," he said, his voice shaking. "I've made mistakes. I've hurt people, and I never expected you to trust me again." But what I'm asking for isn't just forgiveness. It's a chance to make things right. For both of us. In that moment, she saw something in him, a desperation that mirrored her own. They were both standing on the precipice, each of them battling their own demons. For her, it was the fear of failure, the fear of losing everything she had built. For him, it was the fear of never being able to redeem himself, of being forever stuck in the past. "I don't know what to do," she confessed. "I'm scared. But I can't keep living in fear. I need to make a choice." The choice before her was one of life-altering magnitude. On one side, there was the man who had given her a chance when she was nothing more than a hungry child. A man who was offering her the same kind of help now, despite the price he had paid for his own mistakes. On the other side, there was the cold, calculating world of business, where the heart had no place in forgiveness, was a luxury few could afford. As the night wore on, the tension continued to mount. She knew that the decision she made could shape the future of her business, but also her own soul. The world would watch as she made this critical choice, one that would either lift them both up or tear them apart. The clock was ticking, and the stakes were higher than ever. Would she be able to rise above the weight of the past, or would she crumble under the pressure of trying to save something that wasn't hers to fix? The answers were just around the corner, but for now, all she could do was stand at the crossroads, wondering which path would lead her to redemption. With the quiet hum of the office around them, she stared at Henry, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. And for the first time, she realized that the story they were about to write wasn't just theirs. It was everyone's, every person they had ever helped, every person they had ever failed, and every person whose future they could change with one simple decision. As the silence grew heavier, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge was about to begin. The moment of truth was fast approaching, and she had to make a choice. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined, and it was clear, whatever decision she made would change everything. The silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of the decision she had to make. The clock seemed to tick louder, each second bringing her closer to a choice that could alter the course of not just her future, but Henry's as well. She felt the heaviness of her mother's lessons, the ones that spoke of kindness, of giving back when you could, of doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy. It was hard to admit, but she knew what she had to do. Henry stood across from her, his face a mix of hope and fear, as though he was holding his breath, waiting for her answer. And for the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity, like a fog lifting after a storm. She could see the person Henry truly was, beyond the mistakes, beyond the failed business ventures and the tarnished reputation. She could see the same kindness that had once fed her when she was hungry, the same compassion that had guided him to help others, even when life had been unkind to him. "All right," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'll trust you." Henry's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked as if he couldn't believe it. The words had hung in the air, unsure if they would ever come to life. But now that they were spoken, everything changed. The tension in the room melted away, replaced by something that felt almost like relief. The weight of their shared past was no longer a burden. It had become a bridge between them, a bridge they would both have to cross together. But the stakes were still high. She had no illusions that everything would be easy from here on out. The challenges were real, and the risks of failure were enormous. Yet in that moment, she realized something important. Doing the right thing was never about playing it safe. It was about trusting in the possibility of redemption, in the power of second chances, and in the strength of human connection. And so they worked together. Slowly but surely, they began to rebuild what had been lost. The business, once on the brink of collapse, started to thrive. Henry's experience, combined with her vision and leadership, created a synergy that neither of them could have achieved alone. They face setbacks, sure, but each time they came back stronger, more determined than ever. Over the course of the next few months, the woman watched Henry transform before her eyes. The man who had once been weighed down by guilt and shame now stood tall, a partner in every sense of the word. She saw the difference he made, not just in the business, but in the lives of the people around him. He had become a mentor to the younger employees, a guiding force who led with compassion, not fear. And it was then that she realized sometimes it's the ones who have fallen the hardest who have the most to offer. As the business flourished, the woman thought back to the moment when she had stood at her mother's grave, whispering those words. A stranger gave a hungry child a meal. Years later, that child was his boss. It had been a haunting thought at the time, but now it felt like a full-circle moment. They had come so far, and yet it wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about the people they had become along the way. It was about the lessons learned, the growth that had taken place, and the understanding that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could lead to the biggest changes. In the end, the story wasn't just about Henry or her. It was about the ripple effect of every choice, every action, and every moment of human connection. It was a reminder that no one is beyond redemption, that kindness has the power to change lives in ways we might never fully understand. And perhaps most importantly, it was a reminder that second chances aren't just gifts we give to others. They're gifts we give ourselves too. As the woman stood in front of the building that now stood as a testament to their hard work, she couldn't help but smile. It had been a long, difficult journey, but it had also been a rewarding one. She had found more than success. She had found the true meaning of leadership, compassion, and resilience. And as she looked over at Henry, standing beside her, she knew that together, they had created something that would last far longer than any business empire. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from the deals you close or the money you make, but from the people you help along the way. And as the story of their journey continued, the woman knew that she had made the right choice. Because in the end, it wasn't just about being a boss. It was about being a human being who understood the power of kindness and how one simple act could change the world. The end of one story, perhaps, but for both of them, the beginning of something far more meaningful.